Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. I've got apologies from our convener Colette Stevenson this morning and Mr Michael Mara as well. And I welcome David Torrance to the meeting who is substituting for Colette Stevenson. Thank you for coming along. David, also note we've got Jeremy Balfour and Carol Mockin, our members, MSPs online, contributing to today's meeting. We move to agenda item 1, decision on taking business in private. The first item of business is to decide whether to take items 7 and 8 in private. Are we all agreed? Okay. We move to agenda item 2, which is an affirmative instrument on winter heating assistance. We'll be considering the following Scottish statutory instrument, the Winter Heating Assistance Pension Age Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025. This instrument is subject to the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before it comes into force. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice to the meeting. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I also welcome the Scottish Government officials, Daniel Blakey, Solicitor, Owen Allen, Team Leader, Winter Benefits and Welfare Fund, and Pamela Forsyth, Service Manager, Carer, Support Payment, Common Components. Thank you all of us for joining us today. Following this evidence session, the Committee will be invited in the upcoming agenda item to consider a motion to approve the instrument. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows in the next agenda item. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. The provisions laid out in these regulations will ensure vital support is available to eligible pensioners with their fuel bills this winter. From this winter onwards, all pensioner households will typically receive £203.40 or £305.10, depending on their age, and for the vast majority of people, they will receive this payment automatically. We are in discussion with the UK Government to extend the proposed arrangements in England and Wales to recover payments from those pensioners with an individual income of more than £35,000 through the tax system. This tax charge will be brought forward through separate UK Government legislation, and it is our intention that the payment will be recovered automatically and that pensioners will not need to register with HMRC for this or take any further action. The UK Government have set the income threshold at £35,000, which is broadly in line with average earnings. For this winter, HMRC were not able to deliver a different income threshold in Scotland. However, it may be possible to introduce a different threshold in future years, and we will consider the options available. This will now be the largest single benefit to be delivered by Social Security Scotland since its inception, which requires significant planning and resourcing. We are reliant on DWP to provide the data required for delivery. We are highly dependent on receiving high-quality data from the DWP and MOD in a timely manner to enable Social Security Scotland to carry out the required period of data assurance and complete the household matching process to allow us to meet our target of beginning payments by the end of November. Whilst this will be a significant challenge for the agency, they have been working at pace to prepare for delivery to ensure a smooth transition as possible and remain absolutely on track to start making those payments in November as planned. As you'll be aware, following the UK Government's restriction of winter fuel payments eligibility in 2024, the Scottish Government has consistently acknowledged that other people of pensionable age may also face financial difficulties and would benefit from this support. For this reason, following the UK Government's autumn budget in October 2024 and the confirmation of the associated budget in Scotland, we worked at pace to consider options for the delivery of pension age winter heating payment in winter 2025-26, as well as mitigations available for winter 24-25. Within the funding available, we decided the £100 payments for pensioners not in receipt of relevant benefits was affordable and would go some way to supporting those households towards meeting their heating bills through the winter. For this reason, on the 6th of June 2025, the Scottish Government brought forward regulations to introduce a universal pension age winter heating payment from winter 25-26 onwards. Excuse me, Convener, I'm choked with the cold, so you'll forgive me if I'm going to have to just stop and blow my nose a little bit.
Of course. Not a problem. Take your time, Cabinet Secretary.
the joys of the start of the winter season. However, just 3 days after these regulations were laid on the 9th of June, the UK Government announced their intention to expand the winter fuel payment in England and Wales to those with an income of £35,000 or less. Whilst this belated U-turn from the Prime Minister was welcome, it was disappointing that yet again Scottish ministers received no prior consultation on the UK Government's decision. As a result of the UK Government's change in policy, the Scottish Fiscal Commission predicted that the associated block grant adjustment funding the Scottish Government is expected to increase by £120 million. We carefully considered the importance of prioritising this additional funding to those who needed it most and decided to mirror the revised UK Government approach for our pension age winter heating payment. Our approach will ensure that a higher level of support will be provided to those in most need, with over 880,000 Scottish pensioners estimated to benefit from this support. The Scottish Fiscal Commission estimates this will be a total investment of £187 million in 25-26, providing a payment to around 1 million pensioners. They estimate that around 16% of eligible pension-age population in Scotland will then have their payments recovered in 25-26. This equates to around £30 million being recovered from 169,000 pensioners. We recognise that households across the country acutely feel the twin pressures of rising energy costs and the cuts to social security budgets made over many years by successive UK governments, and these regulations will provide important support to households, but it is not the only support available. There is, of course, also our winter heating payment and the child winter heating payment, benefits which are only available in Scotland and provide reliable support to people who have an identified need for an additional heat over the winter months, including low-income households and families with disabled children and young people. We continue to prioritise support for the most vulnerable households with their energy costs through access to long-term sustainable measures within our energy efficiency programmes. I am immensely grateful to the members of the Scottish Commission on Social Security who have given their time and engaged constructively with officials on the initial draft regulations shared with them in April, and for agreeing to scrutinise these regulations both before they were laid and after the regulations were laid in draft. Wherever possible, we will aim to give them sufficient time for scrutiny ahead of laying regulations. However, in these circumstances, that has not been possible. The Commission has now provided a response to our referral of the new Pension Age Winter Heating Payment Amendment regulations, stating they have no further comments. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you for battling through that, Cabinet Secretary. That's appreciated. We will now move to questions from members. And can I bring in Alexander Stewart at this point?
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In your opening statement, you talked about the negotiations taking place between yourselves and the United Kingdom Government. So, if we could maybe update committee on the progress with the negotiation with the UK Government to recoup funds through the tax system, and how will that work in practice for Social Security Scotland, and how will that be accounted for within the Scottish budget?
Thank you. So the discussions are ongoing with UK Government, and I will absolutely provide an update to committee once the final agreement has been raised with the Treasury. In essence, when it comes to the recouping of funds, this is more to do with, of course, what happens with the block grant and the Scottish Government rather than with the agency. So the agency will continue to deliver the benefit as planned. The Scottish Government officials are continuing to engage with Treasury counterparts to develop that plan with a view to minimising the additional complexity and also looking at the operation of the fiscal framework. This is a new type of discussions that have not been entered into previously, but they are continuing at this point. And as I say, once we have a conclusion to those, we'll update committee on the decisions that have been reached.
Thank you.
More questions? Okay. Can we ask a question, Cabinet Secretary? I mean, the Scottish Government has maybe reluctantly in the end, but ultimately it's mirrored the UK policy. in relation to this, moving from universal to means testing, although I would acknowledge, I suppose, that there's no upfront barrier to people receiving that income, which is important. What are the advantages of devolving winter fuel payments, noting that we're mirroring what's happening elsewhere in the UK?
So I think if you look at the winter payments in the round, convener, I mentioned in passing in my introductory remarks some of the differences we have made. So, for example, the child winter heating payment, which doesn't exist in the rest of the UK, and also the fact that when we look at our winter heating payment for low income people, then that is something which is a guaranteed income, which again is very different to what happens in the DWP system. So we have used the devolution of winter heating payments in the round to make a different choices in these aspects. It is challenging if we have a system where we are attempting to move ahead with policies and there is a very, very handbrake turn from the UK government on their policies, particularly if that's done, as it has been with some of the winter heating payments, that have repercussions for the in-year budget of the Scottish Government, not just looking at the future. So that does make it challenging, and we do have to bear that in mind as we make our decisions. But hopefully that gives a demonstration of the difference we can make with devolved social security when it comes to the winter payments, and the fact that clearly it's still very important to use those powers responsibly within our fixed budget and to make choices that we think will deliver support to pensioners who are most likely to be struggling.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'll move to Jeremy Balfour, who joins us online.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you for coming along. I wonder if I can just ask, in regard to the regulations which would allow someone to opt out of receiving the payment and then opt back in again for the same year's payment, how did you balance the cost of administrating these provisions against the money potentially saved through opt-outs?
I think Mr Balfour raises a very important point, because it is very important when we're looking at the design of the benefit, not just to look at the cost of the benefit in terms of what goes to the individuals, but also the cost of administering the benefit and indeed the complexity of that. So as we've looked to design the benefit, we were mindful of the costs of administration. So the anticipated number of opt-outs we do anticipate to be relatively small. That does mean that the administrative cost of enabling people to opt out if they so choose to do so, and indeed then opt back in again within the same year, will be very minimal in comparison to the overall value of the benefit. So the system in essence has been designed so that opt-out, opt-in process is streamlined and is capable of being delivered within the existing structures. So on that basis, the cost of administering these provisions is deemed to be proportionate, and the flexibility ensures that no eligible person is excluded from support should they later decide that they need it. So it is an important test Mr Balfour raises, and I'm satisfied that we've looked at the cost of administration and overall complexity of the benefit as this process has been designed.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's helpful. I wonder, just on a very practical level, I think you said in your opening statement that if all the information is provided to Social Security on time, you hope to start making the payments towards the end of November. I think in previous years, it has got quite late into the next year before all the payments have been made. What, within Social Security thinking, would be the timescale for these payments to be made, starting in November, finishing when, subject to all the information being provided to you?
So this very much is subject to what we get from the DWP, because that's the information that we've been given. to allow us to function. So with the caveat that we are reliant on that data and the quality of the data, as I said, we are expecting to begin the payments by the end of November as we planned to do so. It's the ambition to have paid the majority of the clients by the end of December this year. This reflects reasonably to the process which happens with DWP, similar payments as well. So we are ready within the agency to begin the process for those payments at the end of November, and the agency stands ready now to receive the data from the DWP and allow that data matching to continue. But this is dependent on the quality of that data. I think it is important to recognise that clearly, although this is the first time we've had the transfer of this data from the DWP to Social Security Scotland, we have had other data transfers in the past. There have been lesson learned exercises which have been undertaken following on from those processes, because there is sometimes a challenge around some of the data quality from the DWP that leads to further work and further manual intervention being required within Social Security Scotland. So I hope committee is reassured that following on from previous years, there have been those lessons learned exercise to put in place, we hope for this year, an even better and more robust process for the DWP to be able to hand over high quality data to the agency to allow it to get on with its work.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Mr Balfour. There being no further questions, I will now move to agenda item 3, which is with the same piece of subordinate legislation, which is formal consideration of motion S6M 17854. The question being that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee recommends that the Winter Heating Assistance Pensionage Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025 be approved. And I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion and speak to it if she wishes.
Moved, Convener.
Okay, it's formally moved. Do any members wish to contribute to a short debate at this point? Okay, no member wishing to contribute. The Cabinet Secretary, I have to formally ask you whether you wish to sum up in relation to that non-existent debate.
Nothing to add, Convener.
Okay, just making sure we tick all the boxes there. So I will now ask members the question, is that S6M 17854 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville be approved? Are we all agreed? And I note our members online have not disagreed either, just for the purpose of the minute. Thank you. So that is agreed. The committee will report on the outcome of the instrument in due course. Are members content to delegate responsibility to myself or our convener should they return to publish a short factual report to the Parliament on this affirmative instrument? Is that agreed? Okay. Thank you very much. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and your officials this morning? We'll now have a brief suspension to allow for a change of officials. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone. We move to agenda item 4, which is an affirmative instrument. So our next item of business is consideration of the following Scottish statutory instrument, which is the Social Security Cross-Border Provision, Case Transfer and Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025. This instrument is subject to the affirmative procedure, which means that the Parliament must approve it before it comes into force. And I welcome back to the meeting the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, and I also welcome Scottish Government officials Thomas Nicholl, lawyer, and Simon Coote, Head of the Cross-Cutting Policy Unit. So thank you both for joining us with the Cabinet Secretary this morning. Following this evidence session, the community will be invited to an upcoming agenda item to consider a motion to approve this instrument. I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. So I welcome the opportunity to assist committee in its consideration of these regulations. A key principle within the cross-border regulations is to ensure that once case transfer is complete, individuals moving from the rest of the UK to Scotland, while in receipt of an equivalent reserve benefit, are able to do so without a gap in entitlement. Our intention had been for the cross-border process to mirror case transfer, so that awards could be transferred automatically from the DWP to Social Security Scotland without the need for the client to submit a new application. Despite our best efforts, this has not proved possible, as the DWP were unable to commit to the required data sharing arrangements. This does mean that individuals moving to Scotland will be required to submit a new application for Scottish benefits. This will ensure we have the most up-to-date information when deciding an award, minimising the need for the client to undergo an unscheduled review soon after the decision. It also future-proofs our approach if there is further divergence between our benefits and the UK equivalent. Our focus, therefore, has been to make the application journey as easy as possible for the estimated 300 people per month we expect across all benefits. The DWP will continue to pay clients for 13 weeks after a move to Scotland, and these clients can apply for the equivalent Scottish benefit while still in receipt of their DWP benefit. For carer support payment, regulations make specific amendments to support this by allowing entitlement to start on a future date if the client isn't eligible on the date they apply, something which is not currently possible. For adults receiving disability living allowance, we have developed a process to enable them to request an award of Scottish adult DLA, which is otherwise the closed benefit with no new applications. Crucially, the regulations also provide for backdating of awards of Scottish benefits to the date after DWP awards end, as long as clients apply within the defined timescales. We can also apply this backdating to any awards that were missed in the case transfer process or awards made retrospectively. This design greatly reduces the possibility of gaps in entitlement and minimises the likelihood of individuals losing out on support to which they are entitled. For carer support payment, regulations also extend provision for temporary stops in entitlement, where the payment has ended because the qualifying benefit of the person being cared for stopped as a result of that person moving to Scotland from the rest of the UK. This ensures carer support payment can be reinstated more quickly and without the need for an application. Alongside these regulations, we have designed processes to ensure cross-border applications are identified quickly and can be prioritised. The regulations also include amendments to CDP, ADP, PADP, Scottish Adult DLA and Scottish Child Payment to ensure that where a person has continually disengaged with requests for information relating to an ongoing award and is found to be no longer entitled to assistance following a period of suspension, the award can be ended from the date the award was suspended. Finally, we have also taken this opportunity to make some minor technical changes to residence and presence conditions, including for the Best Start grant and Best Start food regulations, update and add references to international agreements, and remove now redundant provisions relating to the initial period of applications for disability benefits within these regulations. Subject to parliamentary approval, these changes will commence from the 6th of November 2025. For PADP and Scottish Adult DLA, they will commence from the 23rd of February 2026. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We now move to questions. Eleanor Whittam.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In its reply to SCOS, the Scottish Government said it would prefer DWP and Social Security Scotland to share data about clients moving between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain why this has not been possible and indeed what impact there will be on disabled people and carers?
I think this is a disappointing part of the regulations that I'm presenting today. The priority for the Scottish Government was to make the journey for a client as smooth as possible. We will all know from our discussions with constituents that it is a complex system out there, and people may be unaware, for example, that they may have to move to a different benefit when they move from, say, England to Scotland or vice versa. And we had hoped to make that type of that process easy for the client, as we did during case transfer. Unfortunately, the DWP have chosen not to take that route, and therefore, if we cannot get the data from the DWP, we can't have that type of process in place. So that's disappointing, because it does make the journey for the client more difficult. So, as I said in my remarks, what we have endeavoured to do with these regulations is to try and put processes in place to ensure that within the system that we've had to, that we would like to introduce if these regs are passed, that we are supporting the client through that as best we can, and ensuring cases are prioritised within the agency. So it's a far from ideal situation, but given that was had to be our starting point, then we have tried to do what we can to make that process smoother within that.
Is this something that you would continue to press for change in, for that continued quest to have the data transfer being able to be happen automatically, or is this a fait accompli if we pass the regulations?
So it's certainly that will be the process that will be in place. With every benefit that we have in place, we have a system of support to ensure that we are analysing what actually happens in real time with real people as they go through this. And that will be an important part of how we can evaluate if there are challenges for individuals, how big those challenges are, and if there is evidence of issues where we may wish to bring this up with the DWP again, where we're not talking about in the theoretical, but we're talking about actually the impact as people have gone through it, then it would certainly be something that we would go back to the DWP with, because this is not the position I want to be in. But at this point in time, the DWP's position is the DWP's position, so we have to get on with making the best that we can in the situation we have. But we do have that process in place. I can reassure committee to see what's actually happening on the ground with clients as they go through this process.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You touched on it in your opening statement. In light of the DWP not sharing data, can the Cabinet Secretary explain what adults who get DLA will need to do if they move to Scotland to make sure they get Scottish adult DLA?
So again, this is a more complicated situation than we would have hoped for, but nonetheless, then it's how do we support people during that process. So while new applications are not available for Scottish adult DLA, it was important that there was an avenue for people in the rest of the UK should they move up to Scotland. So where we need further information, there has been the development of a Scottish adult DLA cross-border form, and that will be available to people with an ongoing DLA award who have moved to Scotland. In essence, it will be similar to the Part 2 form used for other disability benefits, so clients can provide the further information that are required about their conditions and how it affects them, for example. The arrangements that are in place will allow for individuals to be signposted by the DWP to contact Social Security Scotland if they have moved to Scotland while receiving a DWP benefit, and to ensure people understand the process of accessing Scottish adult DLA, then clear information will be provided through the usual channels. So again, it's not an ideal process, but we have endeavoured to make it as simple as we can for the individuals concerned.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Mary McNair.
Convener, good morning. Cabinet Secretary and your officials. Sticking with data, in the Scottish report it referred to ongoing efforts to agree data sharing with the DWP in cases of terminal illness. Can you update the committee on how those discussions are going?
So, despite the best efforts, we have not been able to agree a cross-border process with terminal illness cases, and I think that is particularly disappointing. We do note the Commission has welcomed the fact that the Scottish Government has ongoing attempts to agree that data sharing option with the DWP for terminally ill clients. I think we would all hope that those clients are in some of the most vulnerable situations, and it would be far from ideal if we are putting an additional barrier, an additional stress, an additional process for those individuals and families. So we'll absolutely continue the efforts to make sure that the burden that we're placing on those families is reduced wherever we possibly can. The DWP have agreed to confirm with Social Security Scotland when a client is registered with themselves as eligible for special rules for terminal illness, and that will allow Social Security Scotland to confirm that status without needing to seek this confirmation from the client. But the process can only be triggered where a client applies for the special rules for terminal illness, and we've confirmed it's a cross-border application. So again, it's not an ideal position that we have been placed in, but we are continuing to work with the data sharing options with the DWP, particularly for these vulnerable clients.
No, it's very unfortunate, just given that time isn't on their side. Cheers.
Thank you, Marie. There being no other questions at this point, we'll now move to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 5, which is the same piece of subordinate legislation, and that's the formal consideration of motion S6M 18126. The question will be that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee recommends that the Social Security Cross-Border Provision Case Transfer and Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2025 be approved. And I would now invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to this motion if she wishes and to move it.
Formally moved, Convener.
So the motion is formally moved. Would any member wish to contribute at this stage? Don't see any indication of that. Does the Cabinet Secretary wish to make any final remarks as part of our summing up?
No, thank you.
Okay. So the question, therefore, is that motion S6M 18126 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville be approved. Are we agreed? Agreement in the room. I'm checking online. My colleagues online are not indicating otherwise, so we are indeed agreed. So thank you for that. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary? I hope your autumn cold... Oh, right. Thank you. The clerk has just said, if I don't see this bitty, then we can't report on this in the normal way. Are members content to delegate responsibility to me to publish a short factual report to the Parliament on the affirmative instrument? Okay. Thank you. That being the case, I can now say thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for battling through those evidence sessions, and thank you to your officials in both sessions also. I will now move to suspend as prepared for a change of witnesses for agenda item 6. Thank you. Moving to suspend at this point. Thank you. welcome back, everyone, and we now move to agenda item 6, evidence session on pre-budget scrutiny. And I welcome to the meeting Leah Duncan-Karim, Policy and Influencing Lead, One Parent Family Scotland, and Adam Stakura, Associate Director of Policy, Communications and External Affairs, Age Scotland. We are hoping to be joined online by Fiona Colley, Head of Public Affairs and Communications Scotland, Care Scotland, and Alan Fall, Senior Policy Officer, Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland, the Alliance. They will, some technical difficulties, we're hoping they will join us in the course of this morning. So we'll move to questions, and the first question is from Jeremy Balfour.
Good morning, and thank you very much for coming along this morning. Can I start? The Scottish Government is spending £1.4 billion more on Social Security than it receives in the block grant adjustment. How does this additional spending affect the group that you represent this morning, if it does? And I'm happy for one of you to go first.
Okay. Leah, do you want to go first?
Is that on?
The microphone will find you, don't worry.
Perfect. So for children and young people growing up in families in receipt of additional spending in Scotland, in recent years we've seen a number of payments such as the Scottish Child Payment, soon to be mitigation of the two-child limit, that have really quite a measurable impacts on families. What families are telling us is that they can now afford things that are essential to their households, which are things like the right shopping, enough choice. They're able to afford the heating. They're able to ensure that their children have opportunities to do things like extracurricular activities because the budget allows that little bit of extra space. So really for families living in poverty in Scotland and who are now not living in poverty as a result of these payments, the impact is immeasurable in terms of real life quality of life impact.
Sorry, there's a lot in this. The older people or people of the age of 50 and those who receive the state pension will need, actually. And I think what the social security system in Scotland does, with regard to Mr Balfour's question, spending more, has just demonstrated what a different Scotland can do compared to the rest of the UK. That's kind of how this was set up. It's very likely that at some point we're going to be spending more than might have been the UK government had set out, and that was absolutely critical to the devolution to the Scotland Act and the powers that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government wanted. I think one thing that's really important here with regard to either extra spend or critical spend is what happened last winter with the removal of the winter fuel payment, the inability to deliver a pension age winter heating payment, and the difference that has, and the negative impact, sorry, that has had on the lives of low and modest income pensioners in Scotland, where we know that before then, almost 4 in 10 were living in fuel poverty. The biggest group in Scotland affected by fuel poverty are older people, but there's hardly a mention of that in fuel poverty strategies or actions by the Scottish Government, and that skyrocketed last winter as well. So resuming a payment or returning money to people to help support them through this winter will have a big difference. However, the best it might do is bring us back to the level of fuel poverty we had before. So there are things we might want to do more of to help address these issues.
I don't know if Alan has heard the question or not, or no. I'll go on and you can maybe come back in a moment.
Jeremy, it's just to let you know, our other two witnesses online, we've got some technical difficulties.
Alan's on now, but Fiona's not on yet.
Oh, we have. Well, I've just been told.
I think Alan's joined us now, so yeah. If I could just develop that slightly with all three of you in regard to last week at committee, I asked for witnesses in regard to should the spend be more targeted on those in need rather than less universal? And I wonder, again, you know, we've seen today the overspend that in regard to some benefits. So would it be better to focus on those in most need, but give less to those that perhaps don't need it as much? Or is the universalism that the government has followed being the right methodology?
Who's that to, Jeremy?
Maybe start with Adam, since he was looking
Okay, Alan.
bemused.
Adam, not Alan,
Adam.
because I was looking at you, sorry. I'll avoid looking at you now in case you ask me further questions. and I've completely lost the place in terms of what the question was. The universality element, I think, is very, very important. Actually, it's something which, again, the Scottish Government has adopted as a position. We also know that we can miss a huge number of people who need something by drawing sometimes quite draconian lines about where that line is necessary. As we found, I'm going to go back to the example of pension age winter heating payment or the former winter fuel payment, that at times going to use the line of pension credit only. But 500,000 pensioners in Scotland have incomes too low to pay income tax, so 350,000 of them wouldn't have been entitled to pension credit, but demonstrably very, very low income. So we don't actually have the right mechanisms at times to find the place to work out who is the most needy. And over the last year or so, I've found it very, very hard to get any kind of assessment from politicians or for government or from others about where is the line of need. I think everyone's circumstances are very different. I think that income or wealth can look very different to different people, and their needs can be more severe. And I don't think that we have necessarily sophisticated means to determine who is needy or not. And I think that lots of people, irrespective of their income or wealth, which isn't liquidity, will be in need of social security support. So I think that it's very important that we don't just find measures and lines to draw that are so low that very, very few people get it. I don't think we've really cracked that yet, and I don't think that anybody's worked out where that line of need is.
I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on this point.
Absolutely. I think there's a place for both, is what I would say to that. So, for example, we know that the Scottish Child Payment is making a huge difference to lots of different family types. However, we're also 5 years away now, 2030 statutory child poverty targets, which at the moment, it doesn't look like we're on track to meet. And at the moment, we look at the targeted interventions in social security and actually don't find many. So we know that for larger families, we will be looking next year at the mitigation of the two-child limit. But we also know that, for example, for single-parent families, for families with a child under the age of 1, for families with a disabled child, that child poverty rates are significantly higher. So I think there is more that can be done in terms of looking at targeted spend for groups that specifically need them. The child poverty rate for single-parent families, for example, is 36% compared to 23% for all children. So there is, I think there's a distinction to be made between where sort of universal provision has a real impact and also looking at where targeted support might be needed.
Thank you. If I can just go to one final question and then hand back to you, Convener, and that is, in the next few months, we're going to see the introduction of the winter heating, the carers additional person payment, and the possibility of the two-child limit payment being mitigated. Given the financial context that we're in, do any of you have a view on the priorities of these particular payments? And if you could, are there other priorities that you think could or should be met as well?
I wonder if you bring Alan in now, because I don't think he's the opportunity to put anything on record.
Yeah, good morning, folks. So on the subject of the priorities of the things that are coming up, in the short term, we would agree with that prioritisation. I think welcoming in particular the new carer additional support, additional person payment, albeit that's a very, very small additional sum. It's still an additional bit of money into people who are caring for multiple people, which is obviously something we strongly welcome, and especially given that the value of that in terms of the Scottish Government budget is quite small. I think that's an improvement to people's lives. It's quite good to take forward without having too much impact on other stuff. We'd also definitely welcome the two-child payment, the two-child limit payment coming in, though it remains the case that obviously the UK Government ideally should be abolishing that at source. That's a restriction that should never have been brought in the first place. Perhaps we'll see something in the budget. We would certainly welcome that. Winter heating payment, again, it's good to see that being brought forward. And just on the previous point about sort of the universality, I think that is quite positive in the sense that there was a lot of confusion last winter, and I think that was a huge problem for a lot of people, was how confusing it was that suddenly this payment was taken away from them, and then a few weeks later they were told they would get it again, but only the following year. So that kind of uncertainty in terms of what payments people are actually able to get hasn't been particularly helpful. If we're talking a little bit about things that could be prioritised, again, in the near future, we'd sort of refer back to some of the recommendations in the independent review of adult disability payment, and particularly noted the recommendations to effectively abolish the 50% and 20-metre rules. We've long called for those to be abolished. Those are arbitrary, they're unfair, we don't feel they represent the realities of the conditions that people are living with. And we particularly emphasised that the 20-metre rule failed to take account of things like pain and exhaustion, which obviously have a significant impact on how people are able to get about. We're very glad to see that the independent review picked that up. Obviously, there would be resource implications to removing those rules. That's kind of the point. We'd like to see more people able to access those payments. So that's something else we think should be taken forward in the near future. One last point also would be to increase the earnings limit for the carer support payment. The Scottish Government had intended in doing that when they brought this payment once they got to the point of having done all the case transfer. The UK Government kind of beat them to the punch by increasing it themselves. That had financial flow through to the Scottish Government to replicate it. However, I don't think they should consider that job done. If the policy intention was to create a more generous carer support payment earnings threshold than existed at UK level, that should be followed through by increasing the earnings threshold again. And when you consider that the value of carer support payment in Scotland plus the supplement is about £5,000 and the earnings threshold is about £10,000, there's a gap between £10,000 and £15,000 income where taking on additional hours, even if people want to, causes them to lose money. So we're suggesting that perhaps bringing the earnings limit more towards that £15,000 point would probably make more sense in terms of making sure that that payment is effective and that it's going to people who need it.
I'm done, Convener. Thank you. I should have just said that, just to declare that I am on ADP at a higher rate. But thank you, Convener, for your time.
Thanks, Mr Balfour. Now, we are about to move on. If there's a very short, pithy comment either Leah or Adam wants to make on this question, please do come in. And apologies, we're a bit short for time. Leah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I think with the social limit mitigation, it's fundamentally an issue of rights. So while we recognise that this is an issue that originates from UK government policy, in 2023 this Parliament unanimously passed the UNCRC Act, and within that children have a specific right to social security. So I think fundamentally the mitigation is about ensuring that all children are able to fulfil that right regardless of what their family size is.
Okay, that's making the point. That's the correct priorities to pursue. Thank you. Adam Stakura.
I think that the priorities that we've got are set and I wouldn't really be changing anything. I think, if anything, I would like more social security for people where I think there is an injustice and imbalance in terms of what people should receive. For instance, under PADP, we think there should be a mobility component considered. Maybe not exactly the same as you get under ADP or what was in PIP, but that is something which is essentially ageist, about when somebody has become disabled. And the idea that you've got to receive a state pension that mitigates against it, that's kind of an unfair thing. I think there's a lot more we could be doing for people under the winter heating payment who are living in cold parts of Scotland. The universality of that is welcome, but actually we're missing people who live in really, really cold parts of the country on very, very low incomes who in previous sets of social security and benefits would receive a lot more on average. So there's quite a lot of things I think are missing, and also for older carers as well are missing. So I think I don't come to the committee necessarily with helpful suggestions of what we might prioritise or cut, but more that actually maybe we aren't doing enough.
It's helpful for that clarity, if maybe not helpful in balancing a budget, but additional priorities rather than different priorities, which feeds in quite nicely to our next theme, actually. Can I bring in my colleague Carol Mockin?
Thank you, Convener. Thanks, Shay. I mean, I've been asked to sort of talk a wee bit about, the balance of the budget, and the panel will maybe know in previous evidence we've taken, we have had comment that the budget is going to be under severe pressure, so it's really important that we look at that. So I wonder if I could ask the panel that, the Scottish Government has set out plans to meet the expected shortfall between funding and spending across all public services. And I suppose the question is, how can we ensure that any budget cuts made in part to afford social security spending do not affect the very people that social security spending is intended to help? So that's across the whole sort of portfolio. And I wonder if people have any view on that.
Thanks for the question. This is a really difficult one, actually, because a lot of the spending, I think, that happens across Scotland there's different responsibility for this. So, for instance, we might see that IJBs across the country are reducing spending significantly and causing, detriment to the lives of people who are disabled, who are older, maybe living with dementia, because they don't have access to services they had before. These people will probably be in receipt of social security, for instance, but actually the health outcomes for them become poorer. So there might become a bigger strain and a burden on the NHS, where the social care spend is not either keeping up anywhere near where we need it to be, but actually the burden kind of shifts away. So I think it is a really difficult one, because what the levers that the Scottish Government have against the decision-making of, say, local authorities, IJBs, health and social care partnerships and others will have a big impact on people's lives. And I think the challenge, if I go back to the point on whether it's closing community centres or daycare centres or restricting access to an eligibility criteria for receiving social care packages now, the decision-making there is pretty hidden. There is very limited accountability or responsibility for that. It's very hard to work out how things have happened, who's responsible, and for the public to scrutinise that. So while the Scottish Government might have measures and levers at their own disposal, other parts of Scottish public life and Scottish public services make decisions which might run counter to those aspirations, but there are no mechanisms to either challenge or really understand them, and it becomes almost someone else's issue to deal with, notably health.
I think I would quite like to bring in, Carol, if that's okay, Fiona Colley, who's just managed to get online. But just, I'm not sure if Fiona heard your question, Carol, but essentially, Fiona, it's as we tried to meet the shortfall in the block grant for what we actually spend in social security investments in Scotland, that could then impact on other services elsewhere, and that could lead to cuts, but could also have a detrimental impact on the groups we're trying to help with those additional cash payments. Is there any reflections you want to make in relation to that, Fiona?
Yes, probably briefly adding to what Adam said. I think that there's a challenge of different parts of the system doing different things that can cause harm to individuals and create costs elsewhere. I mean, we increasingly have found that caring is a social determinant of health, but so much of that is linked to poverty. But what we also know from the Scottish Fiscal Commission is the level of poor health amongst carers at that peak age of caring is increasing at a rate that will cause a problem in future in providing social care and unpaid care for individuals. I think there's a real need for the Scottish Government and its partners to look at investment, including social security, to develop it in a cohesive way that looks at those interdependencies and the outcomes across all policy areas. Carers Scotland, and I think all of the organisations here today are part of a Scotland that cares, that talked about developing a national outcome around care and caring, and that would really look at where we invest funds and how we invest those funds across the system, so that we don't have those we have less of that. We don't have, I think that would be optimistic, but we have less of those unintended consequences that Adam mentions. That outcome wouldn't be a panacea, but it really looks at that coordinated way about how we make public policy and how we invest in individual areas and those interdependencies.
Thank you. Alan Faulds.
Yeah, I suppose there's a point here that I feel our politics has come back to again and again and again since 2010, which is when you cut one area, it has knock-on effects in other areas. You think of the previous UK government's welfare reforms, that just made people's health worse, didn't lead to savings, meant people were more reliant on NHS and other services. And this sort of scenario we're kind of flipping it about, which is if we're investing in social security, do we then reduce spending on other public services, and then does that impact on people's rights and lives? I would be slightly cheeky and perhaps partly reject reject the premise of the question. Like, certainly we acknowledge that obviously there is a budget, the budget needs to be balanced, we recognise that there are financial difficulties at the moment, but if the government fully recognised that there are financial difficulties at the moment, perhaps it shouldn't do things like straitjacket itself with a commitment in the tax strategy not to touch income tax for the rest of this term. Perhaps it should actually finally make some serious progress on reform to local taxation, which is long overdue. And I always make the point of, I wasn't even a year old when council tax valuations were made. Like, if they were to address these long-standing problems with our tax system and increase the amount of revenue, increase the resources that are available, they wouldn't necessarily need to take as many of these decisions to, do we need to cut this in order to invest in this? So basically, if we're in a situation where it's a choice between cuts or modest tax changes, we would perhaps suggest that the tax changes to meet the obligation to deploy maximum available resource to deliver on human rights is the priority the government should be following, rather than going, well, we need to keep our current budget where it is and then cut accordingly.
Carol, do you want to come back in on any of that?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I think probably the next question that I had just links to what Alan was saying there is, is there a way in which we should consider human rights in terms of our ability to either, balance the budget as the discussion is today? That's what we're here to do, to talk about in terms of scrutiny. But Alan has put forward some interesting points. I wonder if anybody else wants to come in on that human rights way in which we can use that to help us.
Leah has previously mentioned that in an earlier answer. Do you want to expand on that, Leah?
Absolutely. So again, under the UNCRC Incorporation Act, the Scottish Government committed, and it already had international legal obligations not to allow rights to regress in Scotland, and actually not just that, but to prove every year how it furthers that objective. So within the budget, children's rights really have to be a key consideration, and we have children's rights and wellbeing impact assessments. That's what they're for, particularly in times of when we look at potential financial changes. So those are really there as an indicator, and they have to be done meaningfully, and that means ensuring that children and young people's participation is at the centre of any decisions that are taken. So that impact should be done in advance, really meaningfully understood, and then no decisions should be taken until that is fully understood. And within that as well, just as another aside, but an important point, as an organisation that represents single parent families, 92% of single parents are women, and women's rights budgeting really goes alongside this, because if we get budgeting right for women, then we get it right for their children as well.
Thank you. Any other witness want to come in and comment on that? Okay, Carol, anything you want to add before we move on?
No, I think that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Marie McNair.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Fiona, there's more support for carers in Scotland than any other part of the UK, and the supplement, the changes for students and young carers grant and the plans around caring for more than one person. How impactful are these changes, and what more can be done?
Who's that to in particular, Marie?
Sorry, Fiona.
Fiona, sorry.
Yep.
Apologies.
Thank you. I think that the changes around support for carers have been really welcome. I think that particularly those that extend eligibility and the additional value, and I think we have seen improvements in relation to that, but some of those are softer improvements. So the level of carers allowance supplement, for example, has enabled carers at certain points to deal with additional costs. But that gap between additional costs is becoming smaller with the cost of living. However, that I would note that carer support payment itself remains one of the lowest benefits. It remains very, very low, and I think we can beat around the bush with that and say that Scotland is doing well and Social Security Scotland is doing well. They are doing better, but the reality is, even with the improvements, the increased eligibility, and with the improvements coming down the line in terms of for those who care for more than one person, the reality is that more than a quarter of carers are living in poverty. They are 56% 30% more likely to be living in poverty than non-carers. And when you get to those who are also on means tested benefits like universal credit, that poverty rate is over 60%. So they're really welcome developments, and the additional changes that are coming in this parliamentary term are also welcome. But the value remains too low. And I don't think that any of us could say that the value of carer support payment in any way enables carers to offset the costs or their contribution to social care in Scotland.
Thanks for that, Fiona, and don't get me started on the lack of reform that's happened to the carers allowance, back from 75. But your submission mentions the overlapping benefit rule, and I know that is a real issue. In trying to fix that, do you have any concerns about the impact it may have on pension credit entitlement, which is means tested?
I think any intention to fix the overlapping benefit rule will need both governments involved. It will need cooperation. We've seen what's happened, I guess, over the years when both governments don't work together in relation to social security, and that creates additional complexity for individuals. It creates huge anxiety. So to be able to fix that issue will involve both governments, because ultimately we want to make social security, whether it's in the reserved or devolved system, as easy as possible for individuals to claim. I think there's some opportunities within the system, within Scotland, to look at how we support, for example, older carers who lose their carer support payment. And I have to say that it's one of the areas where we get huge amounts of correspondence and anger from individuals when their caring role continues. But are there opportunities to look at something like a recognition payment for older carers, and that working together with both governments, where we've been able to offset carers allowance supplement where it can't be taken off reserved or devolved benefits. So there's some opportunities there moving forward, but I would say it really needs both governments to be working together.
Thank you for that. It's really helpful. In the interest of time, I'll hand back to yourself.
Okay, thank you. Elena Whittam.
Thanks very much, Convener. I would like to ask a question to Leah with regards to how we actually can reduce the need for child payments. But the only way that we can do that is to increase the employability options of parents in the same breath. So how tricky is that? Because this committee has previously done an inquiry into looking at employability for parents across Scotland, and it's a very patchy picture. So how do we ensure that the support is there to perhaps reduce that demand, and how do we make sure that there's not a cliff edge as well when you're moving from into work, and you have that cliff edge from the Scottish Child Payment eligibility and not? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think in an ideal Scotland, it would be possible for all parents who wanted to and were able to access employment. Unfortunately, I think there are a number of systemic barriers that make that quite challenging. For example, we know that 66% of single parents are in some form of employment, whether that's full-time, part-time. It can be very challenging, however. For example, if you're a single parent and you want to work full-time, you might have full-time childcare costs to cover by yourself, which can be the equivalent of the best part of your wage, which in itself can make it very tricky to access that full-time employment. We also know as sole carers, for example, if you have a 6 or 7-year-old who has additional support needs in school and you need to go into the school a couple of times a week to support your child, it can also be really difficult to kind of have that long-term, sustainable, flexible employment. And flexible employment is really key. It's about ensuring that employment is actually tailored to parents' needs as well, and understands and recognises caring as a really legitimate form of, as a really legitimate need for our society. And then there's the other point in that for some parents, it will just not be appropriate. There will always be situations where for families, perhaps your child has complex needs. where it's just not possible to do that, kind of, whether that's part-time or full-time work. And social security is really there and needs to function effectively as a mechanism for families who need it, and whether that is they needed a bit of additional support on top of employment, or whether that is that's their kind of primary income, because it's unfortunately not as straightforward as saying that parents who want to work are able to.
Yeah, and I think it's quite helpful to have on record just those structural barriers that are in place across the country. And I think that that's why it's such a patchy picture as well in terms of what's available in a local area. And it gets to the heart of, I think, what Adam and others have been saying before is about, you know, that decision about where do you prioritise the spend on it. And in your view, would it be that you would be looking at the Scottish Child Payment as a type of an infrastructure as well, and as something that's actually there to help families as a scaffolding at any point in time, and it shouldn't be something that we're looking at, how do we reduce the spend in that area? Do you feel that that's a valid point?
I think originally the Scottish Child Payment was brought in to recognising that the child element of universal credit wasn't sufficient for families and what they needed. So there is a kind of broader conversation there about cross-government collaboration on that. The Scottish Child Payment absolutely is a scaffold for families, and it's really essential. I mean, when it came in, families told us that it allowed them that bit of extra wiggle room in a budget. Now they're telling us without it they couldn't afford their weekly shop in some cases. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, as we look towards the next election, have done some modelling that looks at the Scottish Child Payment and whether a targeted additional element would be possible for families who do potentially face additional barriers to things like employment. So, as I say again, it's single-parent families, families with a baby under 1, families with a disabled child, recognising that actually for these families it isn't always as simple as saying, I want to increase my hours at work, because it's not always possible.
Thanks very much. I wonder if Fiona has anything to add as well from a kind of a carer's perspective. Leah, you touched on that already, but from Carers Scotland's perspective, Fiona?
Yes, I think echoing absolutely everything that's been said. We know that parent carers with a disabled child, but also carers who have caring responsibilities and have care for a child under 18 do face greater poverty. And even with the support of the Scottish Child Payment, there are many who are missing out on that. I think there's a bigger conversation within this about what support employers should be providing and could be providing. The investment from the government in the Carer Positive scheme has meant that 500,000 employers are supporting carer employees more effectively. However, that's only part of the picture. If you can't get accessible childcare in your area, then no matter what your employer does, it makes it very, very hard to be able to balance work and care. But I think that we need to do more with employers in this area, and I think we also need to do more with public commissioning, where money is being invested from the Scottish budget. Then I think there should be some expectation that employers look very carefully at how they support, from our perspective, carers and employment, but actually that family-friendly, flexible working that enables people to balance work and their care and responsibilities, whether that's for children with disabilities, children without disabilities, or adults.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful, Fiona. Convener?
Okay, thank you. Can we move to Alexander Stewart now?
Thank you. We've heard from yourselves and submissions you've done, and also from previous recommendations and individuals who've given witnesses already to this committee, that you'd all like to see things extended and more people involved, and eligibility criteria, and the increase potentially on some benefits that would help individuals within your own area of sectors you're looking into. And these are all very relevant. There's no question that needs to be looked at. But how would you suggest that, if you do think there should be more criteria, eligibility, a further spend across the sector, How can we afford that additional spending in the Scottish Social Security payment and beyond what we already have? Because we already know today, we've seen documentation this week about how the whole thing is blossoming, and we are continuing to potentially move into overspends that we have already. So if there are many more that's required and areas that are being considered by your organisations, how is that possible? That the additional spend under the current policy will be increased?
Alexander, can Adam first,
yes,
because Adam quite rightly said what additional priorities there should be. So, and we'll maybe come to Alan after that, given I think Alan was giving some suggestions earlier on, if that's okay. Adam.
Content.
It's a very good question, and obviously the Audit Scotland report today talks about the ADP and the extension of that by the end of the decade. And I suppose, maybe slightly counterintuitively, I wouldn't necessarily call it as overspending. It's just spending on what the criteria is. And I think for most of the money, this is thinking about the social security spend in Scotland over time, there has been more of it as more benefits or social security comes to Scotland as part of the anticipated package. So those numbers go up, but we can look at it almost like, well, that's a bad thing. Well, no, this is expected. And a lot of that money is coming from the UK government to do so. And there are margins within either each benefit or most of them where Scotland has decided we'll do a little bit more. There'll be a little bit more for that payment, or the eligibility is increased. And I think that's there to kind of meet the need. And I think for the organisations we represent and many more that will come to see you and have been to see you over the years, is that we'll see the need in communities for people, and we'll see where the gaps are, and we'll see that the injustices that people face or the challenges that they have, and we'll, I think, rightly advocate that we're maybe not doing enough. I think that there's, to your point, Mr Stewart, on where you might kind of cut. I mean, I've never come to committee suggesting that, because it'll be, but what we might want to look is how we spend money better in places. It's not just about a straight up, we'll stop doing this thing, but I think in terms of some Scottish Government priorities about, for instance, whether it's public service reform or other places, like where are we not necessarily wasting money, but where are we spending more money than we need to? Where is it unaccountable? Are there initiatives that we have invested tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds in, which don't float or do anything else yet? How are we actually making sure the money that we're spending is having the right kind of outcome? And I suggest that the social security budgets, along with health and care and education and others, are absolutely necessary for citizens in Scotland. And I think we could maybe be looking at how the rest of the £60 billion as well is spent too. But again, a lot of this as well is, rather than hyperbole sometimes, not necessarily from yourself, but on look how much more we're spending, this is expected. And most of it is coming elsewhere, and a good chunk is coming from Scotland to do more of what it wants for its own intended outcomes.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, so I suppose just as a starting point, I might refer back to something I believe I said to the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee last week, their pre-budget scrutiny, which is that it sometimes feels like the approach we take to public spending across the UK is kind of back to front. We often consider what levels of taxation we think are acceptable, what levels of taxation we think we should have, and then based on the money that raises, well, what services can we deliver? And what we should be looking at is, well, what kind of society do we want to live in? What human rights obligations do we have? You know, what do we need to deliver to meet those obligations? And then once we know what kind of society we want to live in, then we talk about, and how do we build a taxation system, a revenue raising system that delivers on those obligations and on those sort of principles. So I suppose I kind of touched on this, one of my earlier points, just around, you know, perhaps we do need to be open to making more changes to income tax if that is what's needed to sort of increase the additional revenues. I also don't think we should underestimate the potential for additional revenues from fixing that long overdue issue with local taxation. If we have a stronger local tax system, and there's various views, of course, on how to do that, but if local councils were less stretched and their services were being cut less, that might free up money at a national level that can then be invested in different areas. And I suppose just to a point, it didn't come in earlier, but I suppose it's relevant here, which is that a human rights budgeting approach absolutely should be central. You know, I've kind of said that already, that that's what we should be thinking about, kind of what kind of society we want to live in. And I would emphasise that human rights budgeting is not a tool to decide on cuts to essential public services, but there are ways in which it might identify things that don't have a particular human rights basis. So if the government are spending on something and it's like they can't actually see what human rights it's meaningfully contributing to realising, and whether those are rights to education, health, social security, employment, participation in society, any number of others, maybe that thing isn't a priority. And again, an example to Finance Committee last year is that, and this is more on the capital rather than resource spend side of things admittedly, but if you're thinking about things like road building, does that have as much of a human rights bang for your buck as house building? So it's just thinking about things like that and sort of, A, how do we increase the revenues that we have to deliver in the society we want to live in, but also, as Adam's saying, there might be ways to spend the money we already have more smartly and more cleverly and to deliver on those rights.
And following on from that, so which policies would witnesses like to see prioritised for additional spending? And should that, as you've already indicated, Adam, the priorities be above the areas of public spending such as health and social care?
So maybe take in one of our other witnesses. If that's
yes,
okay,
Fiona.
Alexander. Fiona, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think that I suppose echoing everything that has been said, I think we need to think about things in a different way, including how we measure outcomes. I think we're great at well, maybe not great, but we're good at data, but not very good at measuring outcomes across the piece. We certainly believe that we actually need to think of social security in its widest sense in relation to being bold and developing a minimum income guarantee. And I think it needs to be clear, and I think sometimes it's when we talk about minimum income guarantee, people hear money and more spending, etc. But actually what we're talking about is minimum expectations for individuals around, one, their income, but also how we reduce costs as well. And I think there's opportunities in that. I think that's the way we can start thinking about how we pilot some opportunities in relation to that. The Minimum Income Guarantee Expert Group made some recommendations around some of the building blocks that can start moving in that direction. And part of that, as Alan says, is how do we fund things? How do we fund our public services? And taxation is part of that, but also how we support people into employment and provide them with the right support for their children as well. I think in terms of short-term support, we certainly see a gap for parents with a disabled child who are not currently on means-tested benefit. Their costs are significantly more, particularly around accessible childcare, and at the moment they don't qualify for Scottish Child Payment. So I think that's a very specific thing around looking at that group in particular.
Okay. And my final question: do the witnesses have any low-cost, high-impact suggestions for improvements for Social Security Scotland?
Leah, do you want to help the cudgels there?
Yeah, so there are sort of 2 points to come in, I guess, on both. So in terms of prioritisation for additional spending, I don't think the question is how can we reduce the cost of the Scottish Child Payment. So as part of the End Child Poverty Coalition, we'd be looking for it to be raised to £40 at the earliest opportunity, because that would lift 15,000 children out of poverty in Scotland. So it's really about how, it's not about, although budgetary constraints are obviously a factor, for children growing up in poverty, if we have the opportunity to lift them out of poverty, to give them better outcomes in the long term, it's also a question of how can we not afford to on a human level. And in terms of low-cost, high-impact suggestions, we know that there are a number of families who are entitled to current social security provisions and don't always receive them. For example, we know that ethnic minority communities have a significantly lower uptake of benefits. One solution to that is how we look at income maximisation services and how we get alongside communities in a way that's appropriate for them, that meets their needs, that makes things accessible in a way that works for them and ensures that they're receiving everything that they're entitled to. And that would have a significant impact on child poverty levels for particular communities, but doesn't necessarily cost very much.
I think maybe this might be our final question, which makes sure every witness gets the opportunity to put on the record what they would like to see in relation to this. So we'll come to you next, Adam.
Thank you. It depends your definition of what low cost is, of course. I'm actually not entirely sure that we do have the kind of easy fix for these things. There's like a long-term challenge, I think, for Scotland about our national health. Not the National Health Service, but the health of the nation, which can drive the challenges we might find at stages in life or in later life that will, which will draw resource, whether it's on the NHS, whether it's on social care, whether it's other places too. So I think it's quite difficult to suggest there'll be one or two quick things. But to Leah's point as well, I think something which the Scottish Government should do in regard to social security is look more at how it can work with, and we've had this before, especially from Fiona, work with the UK Government on how it might increase the uptake of things like pension credit. Yeah. Working together on this. There isn't. I don't think this committee's ever had anything from the UK Government which would suggest that if Scotland did more on this, then money would be taken away. That's not accurate. And actually what that can do is open the door for people to have, yes, it'll be more income, but it'll be very low cost to do so. Some of the spend is, of course, elsewhere, but it will open up the opportunity for people to lift them out of poverty, whether it's 70 or 80,000 pensioners in Scotland just now that are not claiming pension credit but are entitled to do it. Scotland has done almost nothing on this, but it could have awareness campaigns, it could have anti-stigma campaigns, making sure there's more support for income maximisation, helping people to apply to help people get the support that they need. And actually, with a bit of money, it might really help other spends across the country as well, whether it's in health and care and other things too. So I think actually Scotland should commit to do something significant there with the UK Government about pension credit uptake, and also because it is a gateway to some of the social security which Scotland is responsible for, whether it's a higher rate of the pension age winter heating payment or the winter heating payment or some other things around it too. That actually these are things which we don't do anything on, but actually wouldn't take much money to transform people's lives, and we seem to be absolutely unwilling to touch it. I think that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Alan Foulkes.
Yeah, to be honest, I think from the Alliance perspective, we probably don't have low-cost, high-impact. It's probably quite high-cost, high-impact, because, of course, a lot of our focus is on disability payments and carers payments, and the kind of changes I was sort of suggesting earlier in terms of addressing the 20 metre or the 50% rules, in terms of increasing the earnings threshold for carers allowance, probably would have quite significant resource implications. But I think some of the things that other witnesses have suggested this morning in terms of improving uptake amongst ethnic minority communities would certainly be quite a good approach to take, and probably would have very high impacts for quite low costs. I suppose just if I can sort of finish with a sort of more general point, something perhaps I didn't get to touch on earlier, it's just that, yes, being aware, I suppose, of the whole system here. Social security is not working in isolation. It's working as part of a wider system, and that part of what is driving, in some cases, not every case, because lots of people have conditions and disabilities which are genetic, they're congenital, they're not preventable, but a lot of what is driving increases in demand for disability payments is relatively poor health, significant amounts of health inequality across Scotland, and obviously there's quite a lot that could be done in different portfolio areas to address those. So I suppose not got any quick fixes there, but just to sort of be aware here, to look beyond social security and think about how do we improve the health of the wider population. Obviously the Scottish Government's got its population health framework, but we can deliver on things like that might help constrain some of the growth in social security in a positive way, rather than attempting to cut costs.
Okay, and finally, Fiona Colley. And Fiona, I'm conscious that you missed out at the very start of the meeting. There was a kind of question around whether we got our priorities right for new social security spend, and within that was obviously the carer additional person payment. There was other things also, but just in case you want to reflect on that in your answer, it's just to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that the priority around care additional person payment, I think, is the right one. We know from the evidence that we have that those caring for more than one person face more greater poverty than those caring for one person. So it is the right area, and extending the run on for those who've been caring for someone with a terminal illness, I think is absolutely the right priority. And Marie Curie research has been very clear on poverty at that time. I think on the point around low cost, high impact, I think a little bit like the Alliance, we've got lots of high cost, high impact, but I think the point was well made around the understanding the impact of health. And there's been investment in short breaks, sort of micro short breaks, and I think some targeted support around those type of breaks to enable carers to access their health needs, because we know that 41% of carers are missing out on appointments. They are not being able to attend tests, including in secondary and primary care. That has really significant consequences. It's really significant if they can't access screening. So some investment there. And I think the point around pension credit, we know there's a really complex system for those who have an underlying entitlement to care support payment. Get a letter that says you've got an underlying entitlement, you're entitled to care support payment, but we're not going to pay it. But you might be eligible for pension credit. Something to simplify that system and enable more individuals to claim their entitlement to pension credit, I think is a great example of something that would have low cost and a high impact. And I think finally, going back to the point I made around public commissioning and actually expecting more of those who benefit from the public pounds, companies who benefit from the public pound, in supporting their employees, whether they're current or future employees, to remain in or return to employment. For us, it's carers, but that could equally apply to parents. It could equally apply to people with disabilities. But actually, we're missing a trick there in terms of really bedding that in.
Thank you, Fiona. And actually, I thank all of our witnesses this morning for really helpful contributions, but also for really focused and very tight contributions we've landed on our timescale for completing the evidence session. So thank you to all four of you. So thank you for joining us today. And next week we'll hear from the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice as part of our final pre-budget scrutiny evidence session. So thank you once more, and that concludes our public business today, and we'll now move into private session. Thanks.